The red and blue lights shattered the calm of the water as they reflected off the surface of Marina, turning a quiet evening into a public spectacle. One phone call was all it took. One accusation. One assumption rooted in something far deeper than rules or property lines. I stood beside my boat, hand steady, heart racing, watching uniforms approach as curious neighbors gathered at a distance. To them, I didn't look like an owner. I looked like a problem that needed to be removed. This wasn't about parking a boat in the wrong place. It wasn't about HOA regulations or dock space. It was about who was believed, who was questioned, and who was assumed to be guilty before a single word was spoken. In that moment, the water felt colder, the silence heavier, and the truth dangerously close to being ignored. What started as a peaceful night would expose a pattern of control, prejudice, and power that had been hiding in plain sight. And the woman who made that call had no idea what she just set in motion. But to understand how it reached this point, you need to know what happened weeks earlier, because this confrontation was only the end of a much darker story. Before any sirens ever cut through night, life at Sunset Shores was quiet, predictable, and carefully ordered. I had moved there looking for exactly that. Mornings began with calm water and the soft creak of docks warming under the sun. Evenings ended with slow sunsets that painted Marina gold, the kind of peace that makes you believe you finally earned a place to breathe. My days were simple. I worked, maintained my boat, and kept to myself. I wasn't trying to stand out. I was just living where I belonged. Buying the waterfront property felt like a milestone, not just financially, but personally. It came with history, responsibility, and a deep connection to the water. The marina next door wasn't just a feature. It was part of the land, part of the legacy tied to property itself. To me, it represented freedom, stability, and years of hard work finally paying off. I followed the rules, respected my neighbors, and assumed that was enough. But not everyone saw me the same way I saw myself. From the beginning, there were glances that lingered too long and smiles that felt forced. There was a quiet tension in the air, subtle but persistent, like being watched without explanation. At the center of it all was Patricia Hendris, the HOA president who treated Sunset Shores like her personal kingdom. She noticed everything, questioned everything, and made it clear that control mattered more than fairness, especially when it came to who belonged where AT first. It seemed like routine oversight. Then it became scrutiny. Then it became something else entirely. Rules bent, assumptions hardened, and slowly, the calm I'd moved there for began crack. What I didn't realize was that my presence alone had already made me a target, and the moment I brought my boat to the marina, everything was about to escalate. The tension didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as rules, emails, and concerned looks that followed me every time I stepped near the marina. What had once been a place of routine and peace began to feel hostile, like the ground itself was shifting beneath my feet. Every visit to the dock came with scrutiny. Every movement was noticed. Every action, no matter how ordinary, was treated as suspicious. IT started with documentation requests that no one else seemed to receive. Proof of ownership, proof of permission, proof that I belonged there at all. I provided everything calmly, repeatedly, believing that facts would eventually silence assumptions. They never did. Instead, the demands multiplied. Photos of my boat appeared in community emails, framed as evidence of violations that didn't exist. Measurements were taken. Reports were filed. Concerns were raised in meetings I wasn't invited to attend. The language was always polite, always official. But beneath it was something sharper, an unspoken message that I was being watched because I didn't fit the image of who they expected to see owning that space. Patricia Hendris made sure of that. Her presence near the marina became constant. Clipboard in hand, eyes fixed, posture rigid with authority, she wasn't legally entitled to wield. She spoke to others in hushed tones whenever I arrived, pointing, nodding, planting doubt like seeds. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. Some whispered apologies when no one else was around. Others simply stared, waiting to see how this would end. The pressure intensified. Complaints were sent beyond the HOA. City offices were contacted. Regulatory bodies were looped in. Each time, I responded with patience, attaching deeds, permits, and legal confirmations. Each time, the findings came back the same. No violation. No wrongdoing. But instead of stopping, the scrutiny grew more aggressive. The goal was no longer compliance. It was intimidation. Working on my boat stopped feeling therapeutic. The sound of tools echoed too loudly. Footsteps on the dock felt too close. I caught people taking pictures from behind railings, phones angled just enough to pretend it wasn't happening. The marina, once open and welcoming, now felt like a stage where I was constantly on trial. And the unspoken accusation lingered heavier than any formal complaint, that someone like me must have done something wrong to be there. The breaking point came at the HOA meeting. What was supposed to be a routine gathering turned into a spectacle. A presentation unfolded, filled with images of my boat framed as a threat to community standards. Slides stacked accusation on top of accusation, each one more exaggerated than the last. The room buzzed with murmurs, discomfort, and uncertainty. Some people looked confused. Others looked relieved that the attention wasn't on them. Through it all, I stayed still, listening, feeling a familiar weight of being judged without ever being known. When I finally presented the facts, clear, documented, undeniable, the mood shifted. Whispers turned sharp. Faces tightened. Authority that had once felt absolute suddenly looked fragile. It was the first time the power imbalance wavered. And that moment, brief as it was, exposed something dangerous. Because humiliation doesn't end conflict. It fuels it. After that night, the atmosphere changed completely. The surveillance stopped being subtle. The hostility became bold. I could feel the resentment hardening, especially from Patricia, whose control was slipping through her fingers. The emails became frantic, the complaints more desperate. And then, one evening, as the sun dipped low and the marina settled into quiet, everything snapped. Police lights broke the darkness, flashing across the water like a warning. Neighbors gathered again, closer this time. Curiosity mixed with satisfaction. A call had been made. An accusation had been filed. And suddenly, I wasn't just being watched. I was being confronted, standing there beside my boat, surrounded by authority that arrived already suspicious. I realized this was no longer about rules or property. This was about who was allowed to exist without being questioned. And as the officer stepped closer, the weight of that realization settled in. What happened next would decide whether truth was enough, or whether prejudice would win one final time. The dock felt smaller as the officers closed the distance, their presence heavy with authority and consequence. Flashing lights painted everything in harsh colors, turning familiar planks and calm water into something unrecognizable. Every sound seemed amplified. The slap of water against the hull, the murmur of neighbors gathering closer, the faint click of a body camera powering on. In that moment, it became painfully clear how quickly a false assumption could spiral into something irreversible. I could feel the weight of eyes on me, not curious ones, but judging ones. Some looked disappointed, as if they had already decided the outcome. Others looked nervous, sensing that the scene was about to expose something ugly. The officers moved with caution, not hostility, but the air was tight with uncertainty. A single claim had turned me into a suspect, and everyone there knew how often those situations ended badly for people who looked like me. Documents were pulled up, screens tilted, fingers scrolling, time stretched thin. Patricia stood just beyond the officers, rigid and triumphant, convinced that power and perception would outweigh truth. Her certainty fed the tension, pressing it higher, daring reality to contradict her version of events. The marina lights reflected off the water like fractured glass as the moment hovered on the edge of collapse. Then the shift came. The officer's posture changed. The scrutiny eased, replaced by something closer to disbelief. Ownership records, legal filings, county documents. Every assumption began to unravel, thread by thread. What had been framed as trespassing revealed itself as entitlement exposed. The accusation lost its footing, and with it, the narrative that had fueled weeks of harassment. The crowd sensed it before it was fully understood. Whispers rippled outward. Phones dipped. Confidence drained from faces that had fed on spectacle. Patricia's certainty cracked, her authority shrinking under the weight of facts she could no longer control. What was meant to be a public humiliation had become a public reckoning. But the climax wasn't just the truth coming out. It was a realization settling in that this could have gone very differently. That a single call, driven by bias and resentment, had the power to summon consequences that facts might not have stopped in time. Standing there, vindicated but shaken, I felt both relief and anger collide. Relief that truth had prevailed. Anger that it had needed to fight so hard to be heard. The officer stepped back, the tension finally releasing like a held breath. The accusation dissolved, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. For the first time, the imbalance of power was visible to everyone. Not imagined, not denied, fully exposed. And as the lights dimmed and the crowd slowly dispersed, one truth lingered heavier than the night air. This moment wasn't just about clearing my name. It had cracked open something the entire community could no longer ignore. Because what came next wouldn't just decide accountability. It would determine whether this injustice ended quietly or echoed far beyond the dock. By the time the lights were gone and the dock returned to silence, nothing felt the same. The accusation had been dismissed, the truth documented, and the authority that once hovered over me had quietly stepped away. On paper, it was over. I was cleared. The Marina was mine. The call was deemed unnecessary. But closure doesn't arrive the moment injustice is acknowledged. It arrives slowly, unevenly, carrying scars instead of relief that I end the days that followed. The neighborhood shifted. People who had watched in silence suddenly spoke up. Some apologized. Others admitted they had doubted me from the start, not because of evidence, but because of who they assumed I was. The realization hung in the air like a confession no one wanted to fully face. The system had worked this time, but only after pushing dangerously close to the edge. Owning the Marina no longer felt like a victory. It felt like responsibility. Responsibility to protect others from the same scrutiny, the same quiet targeting disguised as rules and concern. Policies changed. Harassment stopped being tolerated. Transparency replaced favoritism. Slowly, laughter returned to the docks. Families came back. The space felt human again. But the impact went beyond one marina, one neighborhood, one call. That night was a reminder of how fragile safety can be when bias holds a phone. How easily a false narrative can summon authority. How often people of color are forced to prove they belong in spaces they've already earned. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a familiar pattern wearing a new disguise. I moved forward, but not untouched. The memory stayed with me. The sound of sirens, the weight of stairs, the knowledge that legality doesn't always protect you when perception turns against you. What stayed even longer was the understanding that silence enables these moments, and accountability is the only thing that ends them, because racism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through policies, assumptions, and concerned phone calls. And the question we're left with isn't whether this could happen again. It's whether we'll recognize it when it does. So the next time you see a situation like this unfold, ask yourself, who is being questioned, who is being believed, and why? And more importantly, what are you willing to do when injustice shows up quietly, hoping no one notices?